Malcolm Arnold at work beside Breydon Water on a visit to the Norfolk coast. To millions of cinema-goers, he's best known as the composer of music for a string of successful films, among them Bridge on the River Kwai, for which he won an Oscar, and The Inn of the Sixth Happiness, which gained him an Ivor Novello Award. But he's also written 8 symphonies and 27 concertos, as well as chamber music, choral works, ballets and operas. In a career spanning more than 40 years, Malcolm Arnold has produced some of the most hauntingly beautiful of 20th century English music. Arnold's link with Breydon Water is the church at Borough Castle. His maternal great-grandfather, William Hawes, was rector here in the latter part of the last century and lies buried in the churchyard. Hawes' father had been a celebrated musician, and his son became a professor of music in Northampton. 2 generations later, the family was still in Northampton, but earning their living manufacturing shoes. It was there that Malcolm Arnold was born in 1921, the youngest of 5 children.
Malcolm Arnold, given that you came from that Northampton shoemaking background, what got you into the music business?
Well, I studied the violin when I was 4, and piano when I was 5, but it wasn't until I heard Louis Armstrong and Fats Waller and all those people that I was really interested in music. I was interested in jazz first. I went to a tea dance with my sister at the Royal Bath Hotel, Bournemouth, and Louis Armstrong was playing, and the manager said, "Would you mind if Mrs. Armstrong came and sat at your table?" Which, of course, is ridiculous to say, "Would you mind?" We'd pay the world to have Mrs. Armstrong sit at the table, and she did, and she was charming. Of course, Louis Armstrong was a very great jazz musician.
So did you then go through your teens thinking you were going to be a jazzman?
That's right. But then I got a scholarship on the trumpet to the Royal College of Music, London, and changed. I never lost my interest in jazz. Never lost my interest in jazz, but I became more interested in, there again, so-called serious music. I don't know what we can call it.
And so how did you get your start as a trumpeter?
I used to play in the holidays at the New Theatre, Northampton. And then later on, I used to play on the pier at Llandudno with David McCullum.
And from that, you moved into a classical orchestra?
To the London Philharmonic, and I became principal trumpet.
Under what sort of conductors?
We had the great Sir Thomas Beecham when he came back from America after the war, and we had Leslie Heward, who was one of the greatest British conductors who ever lived.
Tell me about Beecham. What was he like to work for?
Marvellous. He made the orchestra feel that you were all part of the same act, the same joke, as it were, a serious joke, and you were all one. He had a fantastic personality. In my opinion, I played after the war under many of the foreign conductors who were absolutely marvellous, but nobody as good as Beecham.
Very early in your career, you made a name as a composer of film music, at a time when that wasn't a particularly fashionable or popular thing to do. You were one of the great pioneers of film music. How did that...
Well, I sent a score to Pinewood Studios when it was the Rank monopoly, and I immediately got a film. And I never looked back. John Hollingsworth conducted it, and it gave me a lot of encouragement. And I've always been a film fan. I've been going to the film since I'm about 4 years old. And I'm a Yodi film fan.
But to start as a film composer can't have been easy, because the discipline must be quite different from playing the trumpet in an orchestra.
It's much easier. It's like doing a jigsaw puzzle.
In what way?
Well, I mean, you've got all your form is dictated by the film. And I prefer that sort of music which is called Mickey Mouse, which follows the mood and the action and fits closely rather than the overall side that Alfred Newman used to be so expert at. And I find it quite easy because I like films, you see.
How early or late in the filming process would you be involved as a composer?
Well, later on, I used to see the script first, but in the early days, you're hustled in at the last minute when they've run out of money and ideas, and they want music to help the film, bolster the film up, and you come in at the very last minute and have very little time to do it.
When you say little time, I mean a few days, a few weeks?
Well, the worst one I ever had was at Bridge on the River Kwai, where I had 10 days to write 45 minutes music.
But now, before we come to that epic score, one of your earlier films was in fact Hobson's Choice.
Oh, one of my favourites.
What do you remember of that now?
That I chiefly remember was the first time that Charles Laughton had been back to Britain, and he was a naturalised American, and he was absolutely terrified of wondering how the British public would react to it, having been away during the war. And he was terrified, but it didn't stop him acting wonderfully. And I love, one of my favourite pieces is the drunk scene, where he chases the moon from puddle to puddle.
Now, of course, the director of that marvellous Charles Laughton performance in Hobson's Choice was David Lean, who you probably worked with more frequently than any other director in movies.
Yes, I did all his films. I used to be known as Master of the Lean's Music.
How did you first meet him?
I worked on the sound barrier, which the sound department, which included the music, of course, got an Oscar, which is down at Sheridan.
But now, surely half the art of writing film music is to know when, in fact, not to write it, when to leave the dialogue to speak for itself.
This was always a battle that I used to have with Muir Matheson, who used to plaster music all through a film. He was as bad as a lot of the American filmmakers. But when I had a chance on my own, as I always conducted my own film music, I used to cut music down to a minimum, so its effect was greater.
Having then made this very big success as a film composer, did you in fact carry on as a classical trumpet player?
I did. I had a very hard life for about 2 years of being a principal trumpet in the LPO and being allowed time off by Eric Bravington, the managing director, to take film commissions. And I was able to give up in 1948 when my daughter was born.
But now, with that tremendous and early success in film music, were your audiences, therefore, inclined not to take you seriously anymore as a classical composer?
No, because I never stopped writing concert music. Never. I never have done. As I've said once before, it's a life sentence with hard labor. And when you're young, the more you can do, the better. The more you write, the better.
And I suppose of all your films, the one towering achievement for which you got the solo Oscar was, of course, again, David Lean, The Bridge on the River Kwai.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, I was just sent the script. No, I went to Paris to see it. It was finished in Paris. And I thought it was a wonderful film. It's an anti-war film, but Sam Spiegel, the producer, took it to Russia, and they said it's an imperialist film, and they wouldn't show it.
And was it your decision to use that famous Colonel
That was
Bogey
David
march?
Lean's decision. And I wrote the counter-melody to it.
And yet that remarkable award-winning score for The River Kwai did mark the end of your long association with David Lean. Why was that?
That's right. Well, he asked me to write the music for Lawrence of Arabia. Sir William Walton was asked to. And he would write the march, I would do all the dramatic music, and Kakaturian would do all the desert music, and I'd conduct it all. We went to see the film, and we both decided, Sir William and I, both decided it needed no music. And so we had the embarrassing task of telling David Lean his film needed no music, and he disagreed, and our paths have never crossed since then.
Did you often find, though, that there were films that you were shown and asked to score which simply didn't need a score?
Oh, yes. No Highway was one. And it just needed title music and end title music. And that's all it got. They agreed. Ronald Neame, who usually likes a lot of music, took a bit of persuading. But, I mean, that was so.
You mentioned Sir William Walton, who I suppose rates alongside yourself as the major British film music composer of the 40s and 50s. What kind of man was he?
He was the wittiest man I've ever met. And it's very sad that he's dead, because I used to thoroughly enjoy going to see him in Italy, in Ischia. But I wrote my 7th Symphony out there, the first movement.
But before your friendship with Walton, had you been influenced by him as a composer in the work that he'd done with Olivier in the 40s?
Oh, yes. I think his film scores for Olivier were the finest film music ever written. And he well deserved an Oscar for Henry V, but he never got it.
But one of the great characteristics of your film writing is the way that very often you composed against the grain of the plot. In, for instance, Whistle Down the Wind, where what might have been a very gloomy score, because the theme was not exactly cheerful, became, in fact, a very jaunty piece of music.
Well, it had to be, because I don't say it because it was my music, but if you saw that film, as I did, without music, it was like a lead weight on top of you. It had nothing in it at all, and it needed something to gee it up a bit and put some emotion into it.
Particularly at the moment where Alan Bates, as the murderer who the children think is Christ, is being led away by the police.
Yeah, that's quite right. That's against the film, against the actual picture, but livens it up a bit.
Away from the cinema and the concert hall, your major classical love has really been ballet rather than opera.
Yes. I always think that when you set words to music, you never hear the words again. And I could never understand why Benjamin Britten always chose such beautiful poetry. I think you should choose rather bad poetry to set to music, because you never hear it again.
Is that why you set the Burns poem, Tam O'Shanter?
Well, I didn't use the words, you see. I just did it as an overture, a piece of program music that follows the poem. James Laurie said that he was absolutely perfect, and coming from a Scot, that's praise indeed to touch Robert Burns.
And, of course, a number of players have come to you with specific requests or commissions. Among them, I think, Julian Bream. How did you first meet him?
I wrote him a serenade for guitar and strings for the 10th anniversary of an amateur string orchestra I conducted in Richmond. And he came and played it for a nominal fee. He played it beautifully, and I conducted. And then he pestered me for a concerto, and I got so fed up with him pestering me, I did eventually write it.
One that he, in fact, played marvellously in an old black and white omnibus program.
Yeah. He plays it better than anybody else. I conducted the recording, and he won't make another one, because I don't think he could... but I conducted the omnibus one, too.
And then in the mid-1960s, with your second marriage, came another great change in your life when you left London, left the writing of films, and moved down to Cornwall. Why was that?
Well, I've always been to Cornwall for a month every year, to North Cornwall, and I've always loved Padstow. And I settled near Padstow on the north coast in 3 fishermen's cottages made into one, and a garden.
But didn't you feel an outsider in that rather closed community?
I wasn't. I worked hard. I wrote a piece for the launching of the new Padstow lifeboat, called the Padstow lifeboat, because the coxswain was a great brass band enthusiast. And I conducted it on the quay when the Duke and Duchess of Kent came and launched the lifeboat. And I conducted it, and we had a great party and went back to my cottage, and we all got well plastered. We had a great time.
And apart from that rousing Padstow celebration, Cornwall came to play an increasingly important part in your music.
Oh, yes, I studied Cornish music a lot, the seafaring songs and the agricultural folk songs and the miners' songs, and wrote my own tunes for 4 Cornish dances. And I got literally hundreds of letters, I'm not exaggerating, and still get them from people, Cornish people all over the world, who say this is real Cornwall. And I'm really a foreigner. And you're not a Cornishman until you're carried feet first into the churchyard. I'm a bard of the Cornish Dorset, which I'm very proud of. So when I told Sir William Walton, when he came down to stay with Lady Walton, he said, "My God, this is a man with 8 doctorates of music, Fellow of the Royal Academy, Fellow of the Royal College, OM, knighted." He said, "Malcolm, you're a bard of the Cornish Dorset. That's something."
Now, we've talked of the geographic influence on your work, but we haven't talked about the political influence. And of course, you are, in many senses, a very strong political writer of music.
That's true. I believe it should always have an optimistic end, if possible. I mean, not all my music does. You can't graft an optimistic end, but you want to leave people in joy and not in sadness.
And was it your strong socialist views that led you to write for the TUC centenary?
Well, it was a commission that I accepted wholeheartedly. And the Peterloo Overture that came, that was for the 100th anniversary of the Trade Unions Congress. That was suggested by a man called Ted Anstey, who worked in the Musicians' Union office. And I said, "Thank you very much, because that's absolutely perfect."
But what was it about that Peterloo massacre in Manchester in the early 1800s that you really wanted to say in your music?
Well, I wanted to paint a picture of the beautiful summer's day where Henry Hunt was giving a speech on political reform, and he was arrested and the crowd panicked. The cavalry was sent in. I don't know how many people were killed, but 400 were injured. And it seems to me that the activity of these people will one day be recognized. People who've worked for unity amongst human beings, however great the sacrifices that they're made, will become recognized one day.
I suppose one of the areas that best brought together your geographic and political interests was the work you did in Cornwall on the long-lost carols of Thomas Merritt.
Yes, that's so. I love the carols of Thomas Merritt, and I found an oratorio that I was going to do, but I moved to Ireland and never did it.
Who was Merritt, in fact?
Merritt was the late 19th century, early 20th century organist. He was a tin miner, and he had to leave school at the age of 11 when his father died, who was also a tin miner, and he had to keep a family, all his brothers and sisters, and he did it by playing the organ at Illugan Methodist Church.
And to celebrate your great discovery of Merrick's work, you once gathered the massed choirs of Cornwall into Truro Cathedral.
Yes, indeed, and 2 brass bands, St Agnes and Dennis, Penzance Symphony Orchestra, the Cornwall Symphony Orchestra, and we did it twice in one day and got packed houses, and we allowed the television to come in for a rehearsal of this, of the carols in particular.
And then after those Cornish years, you made one more great move to Ireland. How did that affect your writing?
I wrote a great deal of music in Ireland, including a piano concerto and a large number of works. I found it very stimulating. Not the shamrocky Ireland, but the really tough Ireland.
Then, of course, you came back to your childhood roots in Northampton, where you live again now. And there does seem to have been a great revival at the moment in your work. There are unknown pieces being recorded. There's a book about you coming out. You're about to get your 3rd doctorate in music from Leicester. Looking back now across 60 years at a life which privately hasn't always been easy, has it professionally gone the way that you wanted it to and the way you thought it would when you started out?
Better, really. Much better, because being a servant of the public, one is always grateful that there's any interest at all in one's work, because it's a terribly presumptuous thing to do, to say, listen to this, really. But you have to do it with humility, and music, of course, is an act of friendship.